Welcome to Action Science Conversations. Today we're talking about a concept called coherence busting, and Jeffrey, that's one we came up with together about a year ago, I think now. And I was wondering, could you just tell us a bit about what it is and why you'd want to use it?
Sure. Coherence busting is a technique that we use to try to counteract our attachment to stories that we've made up in our head. And the problem here comes from sort of the way that our mind works, as explained in the book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman describes our cognition as being composed of two systems, a fast one and a slow one. And the shortcuts that our fast system one takes leads to some cognitive biases. And two of the factors that Kahneman describes come together to make us very attached to stories that we make up. And those two factors, one is what he calls is what you see is all there is. And the idea is that when we're thinking through something quickly, we have certain thoughts and pieces of information that come instantly to mind, effortlessly to mind. And we have other information that we could retrieve if we gave deliberate thought. But when we're thinking very quickly, we don't even try to retrieve those other alternatives and the other knowledge that we actually have. So what you see is all there is the first part. And the second is the idea that our brain will make up a story with the facts it has, and it will use the degree of coherence as in the story as a substitution for correctness. So a story that feels coherent, strongly coherent, feels also strongly correct. And it turns out the less information you have, the easier it is to tell a coherent story. So the problem is we have this sort of incomplete information, we get a very coherent story that explains it, and then we become strongly attached. So in short, coherence busting is the process of trying to invent alternative explanations. It's deliberately engaging our system to begin thinking of other possibilities so that we become less attached to our story and begin to be more curious about what is actually going on.
Cool.
And I know, Squirrel, that you have used this technique frequently, and that you have a common a pattern that you've found.
Absolutely. So just to give one example where I use this in my consulting practice, I'll 3 or 4 times in the last few months I've had someone come to me and say, my manager came to me with a list. It said, do this step 1, step 2, step 3. It's so frustrating. He micromanages me all the time. I can't believe he's just coming to me with this list of things to do instead of a goal and then let me develop what I'm supposed to. Doesn't he trust me? And what I say is, well, let's try to think of some other explanations for that behavior, because that's a very coherent story. It makes a heck of a lot of sense. It just leaps out at you. But there's lots of other reasons someone might come with a list. It might be that the manager has developed those ideas, thinks that you've asked for them, thinks that you would benefit from having the list, that perhaps in a previous one-on-one you've talked about confusion about this particular area and the manager thinks he needs help. Another thing to do is to try to think of even more wild explanations. This really gets your system too from Kahneman moving, if you can think of even more out there explanations. So the person has just read the checklist manifesto and is trying to do everything through checklists, or somebody else in the organization has handed in this list and said, make sure you do 1, 2, and 3. There are lots of different explanations that you could have, which might have nothing to do with the motivation you're assuming, which is that your manager doesn't trust you and is trying to micromanage you. And I find often writing down those explanations, talking them through with somebody, and I prompt the person who comes to me with a concern to do these things, that really helps them to be curious and then have a more useful conversation with the manager about why on earth they are actually doing the thing. If you go into the discussion with the manager assuming you know, you're unlikely to learn about it. You may confirm your initial coherent belief, but if you go in with a curious attitude, you're likely to learn more about where that came from, and you might find out it's not what you thought it was.
Well, and of course, the real problem is if you go in with a fixed mindset, you are likely to confirm your existing opinion, even if it's not true, because your beliefs affect what you see and it affects what you interpret. And so you'll be interpreting anything that your manager says in a way that maximizes the support for your existing belief.
You're having the conversation not with the person in the room, but with the person in your head.
That's right, and you're pretty sure that's what the person in your head meant. Yeah, it's a real challenge because the way that humans work, we have these various cognitive biases, and I think in that example that you gave, you can see two cognitive biases in play. One is the negativity bias, which is when we have to make up an explanation for someone else's behavior. Whenever we make up stories, it's going to tend to be negative. And that's just, in my view, that's just an evolutionary psychology outcome. All of our ancestors who were optimists and thought that the sound of the rustling in the bush was something small and tasty and easy to kill, yeah, they're gone. we're the descendants of the paranoid, and as a result, we have this strong drive to make up negative stories as a way of protection. We're kind of thinking of a worst case scenario. The problem is that we think only of that worst case scenario. And the other element here is that we tend to think about what the person's behavior is about us. And we think the story of the other person's actions is about us. And there's a great name for this cognitive bias, which is the Barry Manilow effect, which comes from a study where they had the participants wear these terrible T-shirts with a big picture of Barry Manilow's head on it. And then they asked them how many of the other people in the room would have noticed their shirt, and people were very self-conscious of what they were wearing, and so they assumed that virtually everyone would. When they actually measured it, very few people did, because it turns out the other people are busy worrying about themselves and what they're wearing and what other people are thinking about them. And so this combination of being very sort of self-centered in as though we're the only hero in the story going on, and negative leads to us to lead. It means that the bulk tendency is for us to make up these negative stories about other people's motivations. And I know I suffer from that myself. This is one of the things that just knowing that this happens doesn't make you immune. And so what I find coherence busting useful for myself when I am finding myself frustrated in a conversation and I just can't think about a good reason why someone was doing what they're doing, but I can think of lots of bad ones. I try to use that as a trigger to remember to practice coherence busting and think, well, maybe they're actually a space alien and they're planning to take over, and this is just the checklist is to keep me out of the way while they do it. Okay, that's not a good one, but again, it's also implausible. It fits the data as well as anything else I've come up with. Maybe I should try harder. And ideally, I can end up having a constructive conversation once I realize that I need to be talking to the person and listening to the person in the room, and not the person in my head that I've made up this story about.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Jeffrey. Everyone who's watching can find links to Kahneman's book and the story of the Barry Manilow T-shirt and Jeffrey's blog post on coherence busting if you'd like to learn more. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.